Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your SETI Institute Colloquium series. Bless you. So today is a special day. It's a Pluto day, it's a Bastille day, and it's also a Jason Rowe day. So welcome, Jason. So Jason is a researcher at the SETI Institute, and I realized that I didn't know much about his past career because I know him for now 3 years. So I look on Wikipedia and I found out that he was formerly a British pop and soul singer who resided in Bristol, England. But after reading this, I realized that he's not the right Jason Rowe. The Jason Rowe that I know is significantly better than that. Often we have visitors here, and when we walk in the hallway and we see Jason or we see a picture of Jason, I always say, these astronomers have discovered more exoplanets in our galaxy than any others. So that's our Jason Rowe. So Jason received his Master in Astronomy and his PhD in Physics and Astronomy in 2008 at the University of British Columbia for work on measuring the reflectivity of extrasolar planets using photometric measurements from the Canadian MOST satellite. After his PhD, Jason joined the Kepler team at the NASA as a NASA postdoctoral fellow, contributing towards the first Kepler discoveries. Jason is currently a research scientist, a PI, at the SETI Institute that he joined in 2011. He's also a member of the Kepler Science Office. So he has a lot of interests, but his main interests includes, of course, exoplanet and stellar characterization to help understand the nature of distant worlds. In 2011, he received an award from NASA for the development of a model to integrate the diverse types of Kepler measurements to derive the characteristics of the planet and their host star. He's a member of several science teams, including the Canadian MOST space mission, but also the ACESAT mission. So today is going to give a talk about one of these exoplanets that he has discovered recently, called Kepler 138b, which is a Mars-like exoplanet. He will present an analysis of the three-planet transiting Kepler, of the three-planet system, and show how this group measure the mass and the radius of the planet, which is smaller than Earth. And this will allow his team to derive, of course, the density as well of this planet, and show that it's typically an exomars. So please join me in welcoming Jason Rowe.
So I'm going to talk about a result that we had published, me and my co-authors had published in Nature about a month ago now. We spent a good year working pretty hard on this to figure it out. And I want to tell you today about the first time we've been able to measure both the mass and radius for a planet around a distant star that's smaller than the Earth. This is work that was led by Daniel John Tough Hunter, who was a postdoc here at NASA, who is now has moved on to a second postdoc at Penn State, working with Eric Ford, who is a statistics expert. Also worked closely with Jack Lissauer over at NASA Ames. Many of you around here probably know him. Very, very fluent on planet formation and everything to do with planets and dynamics. And then Dan Faberke over at University of Chicago, another one of our dynamicists that was involved to try to unravel the mysteries of this system. It was a bit of a fun press release. We had some fun artwork to go with it that I'll explain what it means in a little bit. But really, I like to sort of give a big question overview. And I think it's important for anyone that's in science or anyone thinking about science to think about the biggest and hardest question that you can have in your brain and then go out and see if you can try to answer that. And I've seen this sort of distilled down to three big questions: the are we alone, how do we get here, and how does the universe work? And the fun thing about being here at the SETI Institute is that you can sort of hit at the first two on this, the are we alone one especially, by taking our proximity to NASA Ames and the valuable researchers here at SETI that do a wide range of research that go from Mars to now Pluto research going on to the exoplanets, and be able to combine it all together and really start having some direct knowledge toward answering that question, are we alone? And I really believe that in the next 10, 15 years that we're going to have some direct answers towards answering that. Maybe not looking for people with us with hands and wave around, but maybe even bacterial life. And we'll see if I can get into that towards the end of the talk. So to jump into it, I'll I'll go through a couple things in my talk today. I'll introduce you to the Kepler 138 system, how we did this, which was obviously based on the Kepler mission. That's been the bread and butter for myself and a lot of researchers here for the last almost 7, 8 years now. And then dive into what are known as transit timing variations of what I think Seth came up with this nice gravitational tug-of-war title to go along with it, which I really like. And then the meat, which is the mass-radius relationship, which is becoming vitally important towards understanding our discoveries of distant worlds and what does it mean for saying, is this Mars-like or is this Earth-like? And this knowledge is going to become increasingly important over the next number of years. So to break it down very quickly and give you the snapshot, Kepler 138 at least 3 planets that are known transiting, B, C, and D. Usually we give them names, the B, C, and D, on the order that they're discovered, or if they're all discovered at the same time, it sort of goes from increasing period to longer period. There's a bit of a mismatch in literature where you can find different letters for different planets. But in all the papers we've written on it, we've called B, C, and D, with B being the inner one. That's the one with 10.3 days. And these were all previously validated in the big exoplanet Bonanza that was done about 2 years ago, where we used the multi-planet statistics to show that most, if not all, of Kepler's multi-planet systems are genuine planets. What makes them particularly interesting, and this will show how we can measure the mass, is if you take the periods and just divide them, you get these nice ratios. You get a 4:3 resonance, as it's known, for the period of C divided by B, and you get a 5:3 resonance for D minus C. The resonances are important because it means that they line up as they go around in their orbit. So for every 3 orbits of C, it takes 4 orbits of B and they line up again. And those resonances mean that the gravitational interaction between them is hitting at a sort of a constant beat. And that will drive the gravitational interactions that go between them that allow us to see changes, minute changes in the periods over a long period of time that then allow us to unravel what the masses are. So what do we find? Well, again, the quick snapshot is 138b is about 1/10 of the mass, about 7% the mass of the Earth. So it's really, really far down. We were struggling just to get to a mass, something that's the mass of the Earth, and we've gone beyond that. That gives you an idea just how light Mars is. And its radius is about half the size of Mars. So that density, about 3 or 4 grams per centimeter cube, is about consistent for what we see for Mars. The other 2 planets are interesting in themselves, 38c and 38d. They're both about 20% bigger than the Earth, but they have very different masses. C, which is the middle planet, is about twice the mass of the Earth, and D is about 60%. So here we have 2 planets with the same radius, but very different masses. So the quick takeaway point I can tell you is that if someone stands in front of you and shows, I've found this planet that has this radius, therefore I know the composition, you can wave your finger at them and say, no, you don't. Because I've just shown you an example with 2 planets with almost the same radius, but obviously will have very different compositions in what makes up the radius that we're seeing. If I were to speculate, 38c at the 2 Earth radii is probably something that's dominated by Earth-like material because its density comes into something, bulk density comes to something like the Earth, whereas the 38d being much less dense, maybe 1 or 2 grams per centimeter cube, might be a planet that actually has some water that dominates the overall structure. But this is all pure speculation because at this point, all we're measuring is the radius, the mass, and how much light is hitting it because we know something about the host star. And of course, as instrumentation improves, we're going to improve our knowledge of these planets and really start to understand what makes up exosolar planets and what makes it Earth-like and what makes it not Earth-like. So the fun thing that we did for the Nature paper was first of all pointing out that this is the first time we have both the mass and radius for an exosolar planet. There are smaller exoplanets and there are lighter exoplanets. The pulsar ones, for instance, are probably like the mass of the moon, if not a little bit less. There's no direct measurement of the radius, but they're probably very small too. And likewise, for instance, Kepler 37b, which came out about 3 years ago, is a planet that's smaller than Mercury. And its tagline was, that's no moon. And of course, also doing that means we have some fun doing artwork. And so this beautiful image, the artwork that was done by Danielle, was to give you an idea of what the system might look like from an external viewer. And there's a little bit of artistic license, obviously, that goes with this. So it's not a reflection that you're seeing from a plane of glass in front of each other. The idea is to show that it's sort of ghosts. that here's where the planet would have been if it had no mass, and here's where the planet is now because of the gravitational interactions that are changing the orbits of planets over time. And actually some science went into the distances between it, and that the gravitational interactions and the changes of the orbital period over time is reflected by the differences in the planets. So by using Kepler and looking at a system that's about 100 parsecs, but 100, well, let's say 100 light years away, we'll be able to detect the change in motion of a planet by less than the radius of it over a function of time. So let's dive into Kepler, and I'm sure most of you here have known about it, but I think it's always worth refreshing you what it is. Kepler is a 1-meter space telescope that was launched back in 2008 now, and it was optimized to find potentially habitable planets around solar-like stars. And it's done a very successful job of this so far. Not only have we found lots of planets that look like they're Earth size and they're in the right side of the habitable zone, is we've also shown that planets in general are very abundant. So when you go outside tonight and you see the nighttime sky, every star that you look at probably has a planet around it, probably a planetary system around it on top of it. And this was done by using a 1-meter space telescope at a large field of view. Again, if you go out and you can find Vega, and then you find the constellation of Cygnus and you put your hand up, that's about the field of view of Kepler that you can see. And it was in that field of view that it studied more than 160,000 stars continuously for 4 years until we had reaction wheels break on board and we ended the primary mission. Of course, Kepler's not dead. It's been revised, what I think as the zombie Kepler mission, or also as the K2 mission. And if you look on your schedules, you'll see a talk coming up by Tom Barkley from here at Ames, and I'm sure he's going to tell you all about the K2 mission. And then likewise, if you want to hear more about statistics that's coming from Kepler, Chris Burke is also on the horizon. He's going to tell you how we unravel the statistics from Kepler to say how common Earth-sized planets are in the habitable zone. So circle both of those. They'll both be very exciting talks. And I think they'll build on top of some of the stuff I'm telling you today. So back in 2009, I guess I had my date wrong, there was this beautiful image taken of a Delta rocket that launched from Cape Canaveral. I was lucky enough to go down there. I wasn't this close to it. I was about that close to it. So this is a picture that I got to take of Kepler launch, and that's not it going up and crashing into the ground. It's going up and disappearing behind the horizon and leaving sort of a smoke trail behind it. And those little glittery things that you can see, those are the booster rockets that are falling down from the launch. And then over on the other side is a star map that shows you the large field of view that Kepler was monitoring, 42 CCDs covering about 100 square degrees. Kepler was put into what is known as an Earth trailing orbit. So it's not going around the Earth. That means it's going around the sun. The Earth takes 365 days to go around the sun. Kepler takes about 371, 372 days. It's somewhere between those two numbers. And that allows it to look continuously towards one part of the sky without anything getting in its way. And then once every 90 days or so, it sort of rotates to keep the solar panels pointed back towards the Earth so it can keep itself powered. And this was the magic and beauty of Kepler. It's away from the Earth. It's away from all the nasty stuff that happens in our atmosphere. If you look at HST data, there's all sorts of issues that come with it, whereas Kepler is sort of in this nice, benign environment where there's very little temperature fluctuations, and it was able to gather ultra-precise photometry. What they tell you is that the better your detector, the better the thermometer that you've built. So if you're going to have a great detector, you want to put it in a thermally stable environment. And an Earth trailing orbit is about as good as we can do. Kepler, because it was launched for 4 years, and it's looking for planets that go through transit, means that that Kepler is a sample of the inner parts of solar systems. Right now you're seeing all this news about New Horizons, that's out at Pluto. Kepler does not study planets that are at the orbits of Pluto. Instead, because it's 4 years and you're looking for transits and you want to see transits, say, about 3 times, it means we're limited to orbital periods at about a year and shorter, which means that Kepler is a very good probe of looking at the inner parts of solar systems. Future missions like WFIRST, which are way off, will hopefully fill in the outer part of the solar system. Of course, there's also current instrumentation like G' that are also starting to fill in this picture for big planets in the outer parts of the solar system, which obviously have had some role in forming our solar system the way it's configured today. But that's something that we're going to explore in the future. Kepler, in terms of its physical size, if you ever go to Washington and you're at the Air and Space Museum, you can see a full big blow up of HST and how big it is. And that gives you an idea how big Kepler is beside it and how big we are. So Kepler is a minibus. Hubble is like a gigantic truck. And of course, because Kepler looked at one part of the sky continuously, it was only looking at really only a tiny sliver of our entire Milky Way galaxy. So while Kepler is finding thousands and thousands of exoplanets that I'm going to show you, it's really only that drop in the bucket of just our local Milky Way, of searching for all sorts of interesting, exotic, and maybe even very common planets. So as exciting as we are, as always with astronomy, it's always just the beginning, because there's just so much more out there to learn about and discover. So Kepler works by finding planets via transit. It's a very simple and very novel method, and it's why it was put into space to stare continuously. And that if you think about the Earth going around the sun, it takes 365 days to go around once, and then the amount of time to transit the star is only about 12 hours. Right? So that's half a day compared to 365 days going around it. So if you are staring at a star and you're on the ground, half the time you can't look because of day-night, and probably even worse than because of weather. And so if you blink, you sort of miss the transit happening. Whereas Kepler, looking continuously, is able to see these minute events happen. And it's from these transits that we derive all the properties of the planets that we were able to report. The very simple thing is that it's how much dimming we see tells you about how big the exoplanet is. So if you have a star with a big planet around it, you see a big dip. If you have a star with a little planet going in front of it, you get a much shallower dip. So that first piece of information, and the easiest piece of information we can gather from Kepler, is how big is the planet relative to the star. Right. Of course, beyond that, a transit also has a wealth of information that's built into the shape. The depth gives you an idea how big it is, but there's also the duration. If you have a star that's big and puffy, the duration is obviously going to be longer for a planet at the same orbital period. So using tricks from Kepler's third law, you can actually have some information about the size of the planet based on the transit occurring. So this is how we measure something called the mean stellar density. So what is the mean density of the star? And that's actually a vital, critical piece of information for understanding structures of stars. And I'll show you later on how we use that for the Kepler 138 system to sort of zone in on the parameters. Of course, Kepler has been very, very successful. This one's a little bit out of date. This is from our Discovery Space from 2013, but it gets the point across, is that we have thousands and thousands of exoplanets that Kepler is finding. And their characteristics vary from planets that go around every half a day to planets that we're seeing going around hundreds of days. And the sizes range from stuff that's the size of Earth all the way up to planets that are bigger than Jupiter. So we're finding a whole big wide zoo of exoplanets. In terms of breaking down the relative sizes, this is the raw statistics. We find hundreds of Earth-sized planets, over 1,000 of planets that are sort of Neptune-sized. Some of these are what we call mini-Neptunes, and these are sort of arbitrary classes. In reality, saying something is Earth-sized, super Earth-sized, and inferring that you're calling something a super-Earth is much more of a blurry line. We do this to make pretty plots for the press, but in reality, like I said earlier, you can have two planets of the same size, and one will be something that you may consider to be a mini-Neptune, and the other one will be some solid body that's more likely a super-Earth definition. And I think that's important to have in mind when you're looking at these types of statistics. Of course, that's the raw statistics coming from Kepler. There's a lot of work that comes. Eric Pettigrew is one of the first to do this, in a very good job of it, was to show that you can correct for incompleteness, because it's harder to find small planets and harder to find small planets in longer orbital periods, and correct for the incompleteness factor that comes into the observations, and show that once you get below about a certain radius, so about 2.5 Earth radius, the occurrence rate of planets, at least in a log scale, is pretty much constant. That means that we're finding lots of Earth-sized planets and just as many super Earth-sized planets as round, which raises some obvious questions when you start thinking about our solar system, because we have the Earth and Venus and Mars, but where's our super Earth, right? How come we got left out with it? And that probably has something to say about how solar systems form and how dynamic they are in their past. I think that's starting to come to a little bit of light right now, but it's through Kepler and finding just how popular and how many of these are formed naturally in solar systems is helping us understand even how our own solar system formed and evolved. And without talking, you have to mention Habitable zone candidates if you're going to mention Kepler. And if I showed you this plot 2 years ago, it would be kind of disappointing. What it's showing is incident flux on the x-axis. So point 1 is 10% as much flux as we receive. 1 is the same amount of flux that we receive. here on the Earth. So you can think of point 1 to point 3 as like your cloudy day, so your average day in San Francisco, whereas 1 and higher is because you're in San Jose. And in terms of radius, is we're finding lots of planets that are Earth-sized and around that magical one solar insolation number as well. So I think that's really cool. Kepler has gone out and found the planets that it promised to do, which are the Earth-sized planets that are in the habitable zone of their host star. Of course, we're not done, because there's all sorts of little other aspects to come towards filling in this diagram. But the fact that we have them tells us that planets like our own are probably common, especially when you take into consideration the very small sliver of discovery space I showed you earlier. I think there's a lot more to go. So let's walk through mass and radius as it was done for Kepler's first rocky planet. This is the artist's picture of Kepler 10b. We don't have any real pictures, so we always get some artistic license when we do it. But Kepler 10b is a planet that goes around every 0.8 days, so every 20 hours or so. And the middle plot there shows you its transit. That is an average of probably hundreds and hundreds of transits light on top of each other. This is what the full light curve shows. This is a few hundred days of data. You can see that there's blips that occur about every 50 days, and there's a whole haze of points on top of it. So there's one planet, that's Kepler 10c, period 45 days I can show you. You can zoom in on another further part, and look, there's 2 planets in it. This is a very common occurrence for Kepler light curves, that you can find multiple planets transiting their host stars. And this was the discovery of Kepler 10b, which was a big deal at the time. Of course, we know the depth of it, so now we know the size. It's 1.4 Earth radius. Okay, that's kind of neat. And then there was a lot of investment of time that went out to get Doppler measurements with radial velocities to show that the host star is moving due to the orbit of Kepler 10b going around it. So we're seeing the wobble of the host star, and we're seeing the radial velocity measurement from that. And from that, we're able to deduce that the mass is about 4.6 Earth masses. So you put it together, and now we have the radius from Kepler and the masses that came from mostly Keck observations, and that showed us we had a bulk density about 8 or 9 grams per centimeter cubed, which compared to the Earth, which is about 5 grams per centimeter cubed, is much more. So this is a planet that we infer is likely to be some sort of compressed iron ball. It's very close to its host star, so if it had any atmosphere, it's likely it was blown off in its past, and we're just seeing what's left over from it. But nonetheless, it's a planet that probably meets the most basic definition of rocky, in that it's not dominated by volatiles. We've come a lot further again since then. I think a very important paper came out in 2014 that was led by Jeff Marcy. He did a radial velocity sample, him and his team did a radial velocity sample of 42 transiting Kepler planets with Keck. And for every planet in there, they have lots of Keck radial velocity measurements. And what I really like about this study is they don't just publish the mass detections, or they don't just publish results for when they actually detect a mass. They publish all of their limits. So you sort of get an unbiased approach towards how massive a planet can be for any size of radius that comes out of it. So over on the right side is 2 examples of radial velocity curves that are phased up to the orbital period as detected from the transit. So the top one, the bigger planet, you can probably convince yourself that this is a detection of the mass of the planet, because you can see the sine curve that goes through the data points. And for the more shallower detection, is you'd be hard pressed to convince anybody that that's a real detection, right? But it does give you an idea of what the upper mass can be. So Lauren Weiss, who is over at UC Berkeley, has done some very good studies on looking at the mass-radius relationship that are based on this radial velocity sample, and also including other ones I'm going to show you now coming from transit timing variations. And the great thing is that we are showing that for any, again, the big message here is for any choice of radius is there's a variety of masses that you can pick that come out of it. But there is an overall relation that's starting to show. When you get to radii that are 2 Earth radii and larger, they all seem to have relatively low densities. These are planets that are dominated by big atmospheres, volatiles, ices, waters, whatever else maybe even. And then once you get up far enough, say 4 Earth radii and more, hydrogen helium envelopes. And then there's a distinct change when you get down below about 1.5 Earth radii. And this was noted by Leslie Rogers in a very nice paper that's just come out this year in 2015 that shows that planets that are larger than about 1.6 our Earth are probably not rocky, right? And this information came mostly, information we're learning from is coming from Jeff Marcy's study that Leslie Rogers leveraged off of. The definition here again between rocky and mini Neptunes is that do you want a planet that when you model it with structural models is dominated by iron and silicates, or is it something that's more common that you would need some sort of rich atmosphere that's dominated by astrophysical ices or hydrogen and helium? But I think this is a very important study, and it's not really telling us much about planets that are smaller than 1.6 our Earth, because we don't really have statistics, but we're now starting to clue in on what makes up planets that are much larger. So now the name of the game is to try to get measurements that are planets that are Earth-sized and even smaller, to try to figure out what variety of bulk compositions can we discover. One of the first was Kepler 78b, called the Hell Planet. It's the Hell Planet because it goes around its host star every 0.35 days, so every couple hours, which means its surface temperature is about 3,000 Kelvin or hotter. So one might expect that this would be rocky because I don't know how you could possibly maintain any rich atmosphere around this without being blown off from the heat of its host star. Which sort of drives into what we're seeing now as evidence for planet evaporation. There's a nice study by Owen and Wu that sort of go into the technical details, a very nice research into this idea that when big planets get close to their host stars, the atmospheres get blown off. And we're seeing observational evidence for this when you look at the Kepler sample. So I've plotted orbital period and log scale versus the radius of the planet. And after you get above about 2 Earth radii for planets that are about in orbital periods or a day or shorter, all the large planets are sort of disappearing until you get up to things that are about the size of Jupiter. Things the size of Jupiter, which are now known as hot Jupiters, have enough mass that they're able to retain their rich atmospheres. But once they get smaller and the mass drops away, atmospheres get blown off. And it looks like all we're seeing left over is just the exposed core from the inner parts of planets. So it's a natural way of saying, well, if planets form and they're based on having some core that then forms an environment, is that the ones that are getting roasted are first direct measurement of those embryos that form planets to begin with. So that's pretty cool. But in terms of trying to figure out mass-radius relationships, say for planets that are further out, looking at planets that are heavily roasted is not probably the best sample to start with. So it would be very beneficial if we can get masses and radii for planets that are further out. And you really don't have to go too far, at least according to the sample. If you get out to a few days where the temperature drops down to 1,000 Kelvin and below, it seems like planets are able to hold on to their atmospheres a lot easier, and we can start deducing information about the natural properties of planets as they form from their disk. And this is where the magic of Kepler comes in, and that's from multi-planet systems. And what Kepler has shown us, and also from rate of velocity samples, is that multi-planet systems are common. It's not common to see a star with just one planet. It's much more common to see a planet or a star with lots of planets going around it. And these systems have become extremely valuable for teasing out the physical properties and information about them. So this is the most recent Kepler family portrait. I think it came out yesterday. And this shows the host star for every system that Kepler has found to have a transiting planet. And if you look real closely, you'll see a lot of black dots, but my eyes aren't that good, so I blew it up a little bit. And if you look on here, that there's a lot of big planets, but most of the stars have multiple dots that's going in front of them. These are all the multiple transiting planets that we're seeing, right? So we're seeing planets of different orbital periods, all transiting the same host star. And we can leverage that information to start giving us both radius, and for very special systems, also the masses. The other beautiful part is that multiple planet systems, they have to be planets. We're not seeing multiple star systems. So I'm going to show you an N-body simulation where on the left, I'm going to show you a system comprised of planets, and on the right, I'm going to show you a system composed of stars. The star system quickly tears itself apart, right? There is no stability whatsoever. But, yeah, and it goes crazy. There's some weird tight binaries formed, but for the most part, I think everything gets ejected. Whereas the planetary system stays nice and stable. But this tells you right away that if I'm seeing variations in the orbits, I can tune the masses of the planets to reproduce the observations. And all I'm using here is just an N-body code and gravity. So it's a very simple exercise. But with the simple 0th order is I can tell you that when I look at a multi-planet system, none of the masses are anything close to a star. They're all planetary masses. And by fine-tuning it for how stable they are and reproducing the observations is we can extract both the masses and radiuses for extrasolar planets. Doing the exercise of showing that they're planets led to our validation bonanza that came out about 2 years ago, where we were getting a steady increase of exoplanets over years. And then when we did the 700 and whatever it was planets, is we decided to make a fun histogram to show that they get higher and higher and higher. And I think the clock is ticking. I need to go back and repeat this exercise so we don't have a big drop afterwards. So. Now, transit timing variations is you're measuring how periodic is the orbit as a function of time. Right? So so here's a big variety of all sorts of transit timing variations that we see from Kepler data. So it's usually plotted as an O minus C diagram, where the O minus C is observed minus calculated. So it's the observed time, so how early the transit occurred, opposed to the calculated, which is assuming that it's a constant period over time. And there are hundreds of systems that I can plot that show you a wide variety of variations that come through this. And each of these is telling you that there are gravitational interactions between the planets in those systems. Sometimes it's another external star actually that's coming in and causing problems. But these are, I think, some of our most precious systems that we found with Kepler. And it's only through being able to measure for hundreds of days, up to 1,000 days in 4 years, that you can pull out these long signals that are coming out of it. You can't do this with ground-based observations. It's going to be very difficult to do this with missions like TESS, which will only observe for about 30 or 60 days for a target. It was Kepler alone that really blew this whole field open. So let's look at Kepler 138 and show what we saw. The plot on the right shows you the observed transits for the 3 planets. So the Mars-sized one, B, is in the top, and then we have the 2 Earth-sized planets down below. The first thing you can notice is that the durations between each are different, which is related to the orbital period. The shapes are also a little bit different. In particular, if you compare the red versus the greenish one at the bottom, you can see one's a little more U-shaped and one has a bit more V-shape developing. And that's telling you about the impact parameter. So is it going through the center of the star or is it going towards the edge? And we can measure all information through detailed modeling of the curves that were coming. We weren't the first to try to do this. David Kipping had a very nice paper from 2014 where he looked at a large sample of these, in his study of looking for exomoons. And he noted that he saw C and D doing transit timing variations and was able to show that the masses were very different compared to their radii. And so we've sort of leveraged off his information to push the research to the next step, which is also to pull B into the fold. Now, to show you how subtle transit timing variations can be, if I phase it at a constant period and there's variations in the transit arrival times, it's going to blur it out a little bit. So on the left is if I don't include the variations that are measured, and on the right is with the transit timing variations. And you can see it's subtle. The most obvious one is probably the middle one, the green curve, where you can see it folds up much better when you include the transit timing variations. In terms of what the variations look like, we're measuring in minutes here now, so a little bit less than an hour for when the planet transit occurs. The transit duration is about a couple hours in total, and we're able to measure how before, how after that occurs. So you can see B, C, and D all show distinct variations, but they're also sort of anti-correlated with each other. It's the fact that they're anti-correlated is telling you that we're seeing the interactions of the planets on top of each other. Transit timing variations are a bit strange because if you look at the transit timing variations of D, they're not really telling you anything about D. Those variations are telling you what C is doing to it, right? So now we have to go look at the variations from what C is telling us, and oh, D is interacting with it. So when you put the two together and how they're tugging each other back and forth in sort of this tug-of-war, it's how we're able to pull out the masses from it. The tough job was figuring out what influence is B having on D and C. And it's not obvious at all from looking at this plot because the dominant variations that are coming in here are from D and C together because they're the more massive planets. But if you look carefully on here, the black dots are the observations with error bars and the gray is our model that we fit the transit timing variations. And the details are what matter. The B itself is pretty much flat and smooth. But if you look at C and D, there's a lot of shuffling that's going on in between individual measurements. And the shuffling is the powerful part that's telling you about the masses, and that's really what's the information that's coming out of it. So why it may look like noise to your eye, those individual variations are actually real, and they're what allow us to make the leverage off of it that we can then use our n-body code to fit the data and pull out the masses. In terms of posteriors, I will admit that the mass for B is not very well determined. We say it's Mars size because it's the closest thing, but there is a wide variety of masses that can be fit to the data. So the top plot shows you the posterior distribution for the scaled mass of the system. So this is the mass scaled to the sun, which is what, or to the host star, which is what we actually measure, not the direct mass. We need the stellar parameters to unravel that, which we'll get to. But you can see that it's sort of about 0.05 is where the peak is. There's a long tail towards more massive and a sharp cutoff towards zero, right? And we did a lot of statistical analysis to show that we are very likely to be above that zero line, therefore we are detecting a mass. This is not a precision measurement, this is a detection limit here at this point, is that we're the first time we're able to show that it's a non-zero mass. We're hoping that we can get longer baseline observations of the system in the future, maybe with HST, and then start to refine the measurement of the mass as a function of time. The other beautiful part that came out of it is not only do you learn about the mass of the system, you also get very strong constraints on the orbit, at least the shape of the orbit of the planet going around it. So in our solar system, we like to think of planets going around in circular orbits, but that's not true. There is no such thing as a circular orbit. Everything is eccentric. And with the Kepler measurements of 138b, we were able to constrain what the eccentricity vector is on that shape of the orbit. So remember earlier I was talking about the transit duration allows us to measure the stellar density. Well, by having a measurement of the eccentricity, that's going to allow us to actually have a direct measurement of the of the mean stellar density. Now, in terms of how confident we are in this mass, this is why we spent so much time doing a lot of statistical analysis of digging into it. So we played around with different priors. Our most conservative estimate is based on a uniform prior for eccentricity. That means we can allow the eccentricity to be a comet if the model allows it. And there are cases where that can happen because you can align all the planets in eccentric orbits and allow that to happen. But we also played the game of putting priors in there, of putting eccentricity constraints onto it based on observations of other planetary systems, 2% or 20% sort of Rayleigh scattering limits. And when we restrict our sample to more circular orbits, we actually get better mass constraints. But because we were trying to be conservative and we don't really know anything about this particular system, as we kept it prior. So that was giving us confidence that we were determining mass. The other thing we did, we played around with removing outliers, so doing sigma clipping on the outliers, and that gives you different colors that's going through here. When you do sigma clipping, we also get better constraints, but sigma clipping and removing data is not the most popular thing to do in science. I think you should have a reason why you reject a measurement rather than saying it looks like an outlier. But again, it's telling you that we're probably getting a better mass constraint than we're reporting in literature. And then the last thing we had is we had constraints on coplanarity. So are all the systems aligned like a flat pancake, like a record, or is it some weird atom-looking thing? Of course, we can see them all transit, so we know they're closely aligned, and then we allowed the inclination angles to vary within the measurements we allowed the inclination to change based on our measurements of the impact parameter. And you can see that the coplanarity from the bottom plot, there's no difference in our exterior posteriors. Now, I've been alluding to is getting into the stellar parameters. I've told you that the transit depth tells you the size of the planet relative to the star, and the transit timing measurements tell you the mass of the planet relative to the mass of the host star. That means we have to know about the host star in order to tell you anything about the absolute values. So we played the trick of using the transit durations. If you think about a star likes to stay, when it comes on the zero-age main sequence, it's this compact star that's a little bit more compact than the sun. And over time, like all of us, we get a little bit puffier over time, and stars tend to do the same thing. So we're measuring the density of the star. So the density of the star is essentially a measurement of the age of it, and also gives us then a way to pull out what the radius of it is. And the only external information we need about that is the temperature. The temperature is more or less dependent on the mass, and then the density that we get from that allows us to pull out the radius. So the plot there shows you evolution tracks for stars of all different masses and how they change with time. So somewhere towards the middle, around 5,000, 6,000 Kelvin, you can see a star like the sun that sort of moves upwards in the diagram. So its density gets less, but its temperature stays relatively constant. So we went to literature, we pulled the effective temperature based on spectroscopy, and then we used our transit measurement to put together to measure the density. Now, why the eccentricity matters is also determined on Kepler's laws. For a circular orbit, the speed of the planet is constant with time. When it's eccentric, it speeds up when it's closer to the host star, right? This is one of Kepler's laws that we learn all the time in mechanics. So if the planet is very eccentric, we could be catching it in a weird part of its orbit, right? Maybe during periastron. That means that the duration is no longer directly related to the density of the star unless we know something about the eccentricity. And that's where the transit timing variations of giving us that constraint on the orbital parameters then allow us to go ahead and pull out that mean stellar density based on our transit models. So in this case, the top panel shows you the transit with our best fit model laid on top of it, and then the bottom shows our posterior distribution of the mean stellar density that comes from the TTV eccentricity constraints and the duration of the model, and the duration based on the transit fit. And we get a density, it's about 9 plus or minus 2 grams per centimeter cubed. For reference, the sun is about 1.5, so this is a much more dense star. And dense stars are typically cooler. Right? So what we're looking at here is a star that's around 3,800 Kelvin, an M star, and it has a high density because we're being dominated by electron degeneracy towards the core, which makes it a fairly dense object. So we can pull that information all together now. So we can use evolutionary tracks for a star that's around 3,800 Kelvin. We can mix in our constraint from the density, which is 1 and 2 sigmas based on the 2 color bars that are going across here. And then we can take the measurements that come from other literature values that are based on the temperature and log G in composition and put it all together to measure how big the star is. So it's about half the size of the sun, and also get the radius, which is a little bit less than half the size of the sun. And when you pull that together, that allows us to show that Kepler 138b is about 7% the size of 7% the mass of the Earth, and about half the size of the Earth. So something that really resembles mass, or resembles Mars, at least at its bulk composition level. Now, I'm showing you numbers, but I'm not really showing you what it means in the grand picture of things. So I'm going to show you an animation that shows you our current knowledge of mass-radius relationship for all planets that we know about for time. So the solar system planets will be shown in red, and then all the measurements of different planets will be shown around it with their error bars. And I just sort of colored it with blue being low-density planets, so something that resembles a volatile-rich planet, maybe something like Jupiter, maybe something like Neptune. And then some other ones are in yellow, which are high-density ones, which you might think of being ones that might be rocky. And then Kepler 138 will come into the picture as the animation progresses. So there goes Saturn. You can say goodbye to it. And here comes Uranus and Neptune. They're about 4 times the size of the Earth and about 20 times as massive. And then we get to the super-Earth regime that we're seeing now, which is where most of the rate of velocities and transit timing variations are filling in. And then we can highlight Kepler 138 B, C, and D. These are amongst 3 of the smallest and lightest planets for which we've been able to determine both the mass and radius by far. Right? So this is the first measurements to fill in what this diagram looks like for planets that are Earth-sized and smaller. Right? And I want to keep iterating that point I said earlier, that just because you know the radius means you know nothing about the composition. Right? So if I look on this, pick anything you like. Pick 2 Earth radii, for example. You can see that there is a wide variety of bulk densities that you can fit to it. Right? Likewise, you could probably say the thing about Earth radius, but we really don't have any information for planets that are sort of that radius and smaller. And so having our first measurement, albeit not the most precise one, is really the next big step forward towards determining how do we form small planets in distant solar systems. Do they always have to be rocky? Are they iron balls, or are they little puffy things that are left over from the formation? We really don't know answers to this. Everyone's got their own favorite theory for what's might happen, but it's our first direct measurements for actually probing planet formation at the smallest scales. And this is sort of, again, to zoom in on it to give you an idea of the potentially what you might derive from having both the mass and radius. So is something rocky? Is it sort of some mixed composition, or is it gaseous? And Kepler 138 is our first time that we're starting to fill into this diagram. But I don't want to finish here. I want to actually fill in many more observations into this part of the diagram. And it really is just the beginning, right? This is your log-log scale, so you can sort of stretch it out a little bit instead of linear, just to show you how much further we need to go to populate this part of the diagram. We're used to seeing pictures of the solar system. I can update it now because this came on Twitter today, so there's Pluto with its heart. But this is what we've been using for as long as we can remember for how we think planets planets and their composition must be. And by having transit timing measurements, which are able to probe masses and radii for planets further away from their host star, is we're going to start to fill in this picture and ask, is this true, or are we just being biased for what we see around us? And I think this is very important for when we look at the news. This was a snapshot I took back in 2014 from the Globe and Mail. I'm Canadian, so I read Canadian news. But apart from the Caribou news, right in the middle was Kepler 186f, which was Kepler's first discovery of an Earth-sized planet in the Habitable zone. And the artist's pictures always show it as some rocky, beautiful place to live, right? But I kind of want to shy away from the popular media and how they want to present this and sort of give some ground truth in that we really don't know this, right? While it's true, it's the first validated Earth-sized planet in the Habitable zone of another star, it is not the first validated Earth-like planet in the habitable zone of another star. And I think that's going to be a long way off before we can actually say that. But it's important to happen. And that sort of comes into, again, what is the composition? Because we don't know anything other than the radius, is that I can easily convince you that this must be an iron planet, so it's 4 times as massive. Maybe it's ice. Maybe it's some exotic thing. Maybe it's xenon. I don't know. Right? But again, this is sort of driving the point home that we like to pretend that these things are beautiful places to live, but we don't know that yet. Right? That's going to happen with time. And by filling in the mass-radius relationship with measurements, say, based on transit timing variations, we can get a more probabilistic estimate of how often small rocky planets actually form. Right? And this is I think you're seeing more literature coming out on this over time. Of course, we're not done there. Kepler is now sort of in the books, at least Kepler Classic. We have tests coming up, which will be giving us the best candidates to follow up with JWST. JWST is, I'm actually really excited about JWST, regardless of how much it costs. I think we need this mission. It's going to give us the next thing, which is looking at the atmospheres of these planets. I've told you that all the information comes from the transit. Well, atmospheres also come from the transits as well. When the planet goes in front of its host star, the light from the star is going to pass through the upper atmosphere of the planet. So whatever that planet's made out of, it's going to embed that information in the color of the light that's coming towards us. JWST is building instruments on board, spectrographs, that will hopefully be able to tease out the information of the composition of small rocky planets. And then we can say, here's something that looks like it's the size of the Earth, and it's got a nice atmosphere. We know the scale height of it, so it probably has a good composition. And we know what the atmosphere is made out of. So does it have oxygen? Does it have ozone? Does it have water? Those will be the big questions to ask. And I bet you if someone says we've seen it, someone else is going to put their hand up and say it must be habitable. And then someone else will put their hand up and say, no, you're absolutely wrong, right? But that's science. And then what I'm waiting for is actually the smelloscope, because I want to know if there's methane, but we shall see. So I'll end there, and I'll take questions if you have them. But Kepler 138b, again, is the first planet where we have both the mass and radius for something that's smaller than the Earth. And this is going to be vitally important moving forward for determining compositions and probabilistic compositions of planets that are Earth-sized and smaller. And just to sort of whet your appetite, as I showed you a rich variety of transit timing variations, well, we are in the process of analyzing lots of them right now. And we're hoping to have masses and radii for lots of systems to start populating that mass radius diagram with all sorts of intriguing claims and statements, and we'll see what happens. But I'm hoping next time I stand up here is that part of the diagram will be becoming more and more rich. And then if you want something for your desktop and you like this Kepler family portrait, you can come up with your cell phone and you can snap which one you want. If you take the one on the right, it'll probably break your cell phone. If you do the one on the left, it'll probably be just fine. And then you can zoom in and check out all of Kepler's planets. But other than that, I'll take any questions you have, and thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions. And there.
Is the TESS telescope designed for a single transit at a time so that it focuses on one star at a time that's known to be about due for a transit? Or is it a survey telescope like Kepler was?
Sure. So the TESS telescope, and we just call it TESS because it's easier. The Transiting Exosolar Planet Survey Telescope or something like, I always forget the acronym, but the TESS telescope is actually similar to Kepler. So it's a wide field of view that will study a large population of stars continuously for at least 30 days, if not longer. It really depends on what part of the sky it is. So it's very similar to Kepler. And the idea is not to look at sort of faintish stars like Kepler, so 10th magnitude and fainter, but to look at the brightest stars that you can see with your own eyes, as well as the nearby M-dwarf population, to try to find close-in transiting planets that are going around them. Because if you can find a planet that's close-in and transiting, it means that transits happen rapidly. And so if you have an instrument like an instrument aboard JWST, is you have a high signal-to-noise transit occurring that allows you to be able to pull out atmospheric characteristics. So TESS is sort of a pathfinder for instruments, for telescopes like JWST and other ground-based instruments such as the HARP telescope and Keck for doing radial velocities for getting both masses and radius.
Hello.
Hi.
So thinking of the mass and radius charts and the fact that our solar system has 2 Earth-sized planets roughly in the habitable zone, although one could argue Venus is not quite in the habitable zone, based on local knowledge. And but if we were looking at our solar system from a distance of Kepler, 3,000 light years or whatever, it would look like 2 Earth-sized planets, possibly in the habitable zone of the star. Obviously, one has life and the other doesn't. So, do you have a sense of the Earth-sized planets that are the targets? Do you have any sense of what percentage might be more Earth-like as opposed to Venus-like, or even Mars-like if they're on the outside edge? Or are you not allowed to say yet, or what?
Yeah, so saying something is Earth-like, Venus-like, and Mars-like is always sort of takes a little bit of inference to go with it, right? Sure. So let's think about the example of the Earth, I think, or our solar system, and viewed from external perspective. It's because our solar system planets are so spread out compared to these compact dynamical systems we're finding with Kepler, so 10 days and 13 days and 20 days. If you looked towards the Earth, or towards our sun from a distant observer, you would never see both Venus and the Earth transit at the same time, because there's too much of a misalignment, right? But that said, say you can measure everything about our solar system, the mass and radius, would you be able to deduce that one is Venus and one is the Earth, right? And you would probably, if you had the same knowledge we did, is you would look at how much heat and light hits the planet and say, well, if it has carbon oxygen, therefore it's a runaway greenhouse effect, so it must be Venus, right? So, and this one is further out, it's at the right temperature, it must be Earth-like, right? But it's all based on determining how much flux is reaching the surface of the planet based on our characteristics of the host star and how far away it is. And that's really the information we have. But if we see it transit and we can deduce what the atmosphere is made out of, then I think you have a much better chance of saying, is it Venus-like or is it Earth-like? Or you can add other definitions and say, maybe it's early Earth-like, right? And life hasn't really transformed the atmosphere as we see it, right? Or maybe it's late Earth-like and it looks like a nuclear stockpile or something, right? I don't know. But these are things that will happen with time. In terms of, have we found any secret planets that are exactly like Earth? No, we haven't done that yet. And honestly, it's those types of things, as soon as we find them, people rush to tell you about them as soon as possible. It's the same thing about if we found alien life, you'd know about it by now, because nobody can keep that a secret.
Yeah. Regarding this chart, what star type does it start with and what does it end with?
Sure. So the biggest star that you see there is going to be a evolved red giant star. It's going to be about 8 times the size of our sun. The mass similar-ish because it's an evolved star. And all the way at the bottom, those little tiny specks that you can see, those will be our lowest massed M-dwarfs. And they'll be about 20% to 30% the size of the sun. That lone dot, look, I didn't clip it off, but that lone dot there, that's the size of the sun, to give you a reference. And that dot that you may or may not see in front of it is the size of Jupiter. And if you download the high resolution version and zoom way in, you will be able to find the Earth, I promise you, with PUT there. So, you're welcome.
I have one question. You show this one of your slides. You show the different type of composition you have for this one. Yes, yeah. Rocky, iron, and ice, and with question marks and so on. We had a talk, like we had a session at the AJU 2 years ago, and this one of the speakers came out with these very exotic models to explain formation of super Earths and the density of super Earths with layers of water and ice and a very thick atmosphere. And basically, the conclusion will be that if from the Kepler data you derive the mass and the density, the people will discard this as a real observation because the density will be very low.
Right.
So my question is, have you seen already in Kepler some very exotic planets that will have such a low bulk density? That could be.
The answer is probably yes, but when you get to low densities and low masses, it means they're at the cusp of discovery. So if you look at the Jeff Marcy sample, for instance, you can find small planets that just have upper limits on what we think the density is. And a lot of these look like they're just low density things. There's not enough information to really differentiate between something that is, say, very exotic, say styrofoam or something, 0.1 grams per centimeter cubed, as opposed to something that might be more water dominated, say at the gram per centimeter cube level. So we don't have that precision of information yet. But I think when we get into the TESS realm and we have planets around very bright stars, is that the rate of velocities are going to be much easier to obtain. Right? Rather than doing 30-minute integrations on a 10-meter telescope to try to get to that meter per second regime, is we can do it on, well, Keck as well, but also smaller telescopes on stars that have much, much more light that we can detect to get to below a meter per second to improve the precision on these mass radius measurements. And then maybe we'll start pulling out some of these exotics and try to figure out what's going on. The caveat, obviously, is that for any mass and radius, there is a wide variety of internal compositions that you can generate to produce that mass and radius. Right? I've heard it called like a Toblerone bar, where there's 3 corners and you can mix it any way you like that comes out of it. But the other caution that comes out of it is there's a lot of people now that are taking the specific Earth composition and then simply scaling it to larger masses and larger radii and saying, this is what the Earth must look like. But I don't think that's a valid approach. There was a talk that was here, I think his name was Stevenson, it was like a year or 2 ago, that was talking about when you have these large masses, and if you put an Earth composition inside of it, the internal densities are going to strip apart any internal composition. And you're no longer going to have a nice mantle and crust and magnetic fields. All that stuff's going to break apart, and it's not going to look anything like the Earth is anymore. Right? With Kepler 186, the reason we made such a big deal of it was because it was Earth-sized. That if it did have a composition similar to the Earth, it would be able to maintain all those interior characteristics that would make it Earth-like. Right? So that's why the radius matters in that case for finding something in a Habitable zone, right? Because you can produce an Earth-like planet. Whereas if something is 2 Earth radii for something, it's difficult, at least with any current theory, to produce something that's Earth-like with that much mass, just because the interior structure just turns into something completely different, right? We like having our magnetic field that shields us from the sun. That may completely disappear under those other types of extreme conditions. I totally expect that we will find, well, we always find the unexpected, obviously, but I totally expect that when we get down to these small radius, we're going to find a wide variety of compositions that are possible. And all of that is going to be tied into the soup of planet formation and how that process completed itself. Because you have the formation of the embryos and then the gas forming around it. Then you have the evolution of the system with the, with the dynamics and the migration of them. And then all the planets smash into each other and produce all sorts of other things and mix and mash. And then the comets come in and do their thing, right? And all of that, I think, will produce a very wide variety and mix of composition and planets that we'll be able to study in the future, which I think is good, right? We'll learn more about our own solar system that way.
Okay, thank you very much. Something I didn't say in the introduction is that in September you are going back to the frozen Canada.
That's right.
You're going to still work at the SETI Institute, but you're also going to be working at the University of Montreal at the Institut des Sciences Planétaires.
I got to work on that.
Congratulations, you're going to be working on a lot of this. So just to make sure you don't forget about us and you come back often, you have this wonderful mug to remember the SETI Institute and the talks you gave here. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.